The dust cloud rising from the stagecoach wheels was visible long before the vehicle itself rolled into San Elizario, Texas. And Kieran Garrett stood at the edge of town watching it approach with a mixture of hope and dread knotting his stomach. It was August of 1878, and the desert heat shimmered off the hard, packed earth like water, making the approaching coach seem almost like a mirage. Kieran pulled his hat lower over his eyes, shielding them from the glare as he waited. Somewhere in that coach was Rose Gardner, the woman whose letters had filled his evenings for the past 6 months with something that felt dangerously close to hope. They had corresponded through a matrimonial agency back east, and though he had tried to keep his expectations modest, he found himself anxious to finally meet her in person. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the small station, its wheels kicking up another plume of dust that settled slowly in the still air. The driver climbed down first, stretching his back with a groan, followed by 2 male passengers who looked grateful to be off the cramped bench. Kieran stepped forward, his heart beating faster as he waited for Rose to emerge. When no one else appeared, the driver walked to the coach door and opened it. "Madam, we have arrived in San Elizario." There was no response. The driver leaned in further, then turned back with concern written across his weathered face. "Sir, are you Kieran Garrett?" "I am," Kieran said, stepping forward quickly. "Your bride, I think something is wrong with her. She has been barely conscious the last 50 miles. Kieran did not wait for more explanation. He reached the coach in 3 long strides and looked inside. A woman lay slumped against the far wall of the coach, her face flushed bright red with fever, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Even in her current state, he could see she was beautiful, with delicate features and a refined quality that spoke of her Eastern upbringing. "Rose," he said, but she did not stir. He climbed into the coach and placed a hand on her forehead. She was burning up, her skin so hot it shocked him. "How long has she been like this?" "She started feeling poorly yesterday afternoon," the driver said. "Said it was just the heat, but by nightfall she was talking out of her head. I wanted to stop in El Paso, but she insisted on making it here." Kieran gathered Rose into his arms, surprised by how light she was. She murmured something incoherent as he lifted her, her head falling against his chest. "I need to get her to my ranch," he said. "Can someone fetch Dr. Morrison?" "He left town 2 days ago," one of the passengers said. "Went to Fort Davis to tend to some soldiers. Will not be back for at least a week." Kieran cursed under his breath. The ranch was 5 miles outside of town, and without a doctor, he would have to manage on his own. It was not the first time he had nursed someone through an illness. He had tended his mother through pneumonia before she passed, and helped many of his ranch hands through various ailments over the years. But this was different. This was the woman he had hoped to marry, and she was burning up with fever before he had even properly met her. "Get her trunk," he ordered, already moving toward his wagon. His foreman, Miguel, who had accompanied him to town, quickly helped secure Rose in the back of the wagon on a bed of hay covered with blankets. Kieran climbed back with her while Miguel took the reins. As they made the journey back to the ranch, Kieran tried to get Rose to drink some water from his canteen, but most of it just dribbled down her chin. She was lost in the fever, occasionally muttering words he could not make out. He studied her face as the wagon jostled along the rutted road. She was younger than he had expected, probably not more than 22 or 23. In her letters, she had written about working as a governess in Boston, about the death of her parents in a house fire, about wanting a fresh start in a new place. She had seemed practical and clear-headed in her correspondence, with a quiet humor that had drawn him to her more than any flowery declarations might have. The Garrett ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. It was a modest spread, about 2,000 acres of grazing land with a sturdy house that Kieran had built himself over the course of several years. The main house was 2 stories, unusual for the area, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. He had built it larger than necessary with the hope that someday he might have a family to fill it. "Take her upstairs to the guest room," Kieran told Miguel as they pulled up to the house. "And have your wife come help me. I will need water, lots of it, and clean cloths." Miguel's wife, Carmen, was already hurrying from the house, alerted by the sound of the wagon. She took one look at Rose and began issuing orders in rapid Spanish to Miguel, who hurried to comply. Between the 3 of them, they got Rose upstairs and into the bed in the guest room, which faced east and caught the morning sun. "I will make willow bark tea," Carmen said, already moving toward the door, "and bring cool water to bring down the fever." Kieran nodded, grateful for her practical help. When she left, he set about removing Rose's traveling clothes, which were soaked through with sweat. It felt improper to undress her when they had not even been properly introduced, but modesty had no place when someone's life was at stake. He worked quickly and clinically, removing the heavy dress and layers of petticoats that would only trap the heat, leaving her in just her chemise. Even that light garment was damp, but it would have to do. Carmen returned with a basin of cool water and several cloths. "The fever is very high," she said, pressing her hand to Rose's forehead. "What do you think it is?" "Could be anything," Kieran said. "The journey from Boston is long and hard. She could have picked up something along the way, or it might just be heat exhaustion." They worked together through the evening, bathing Rose's face and arms with cool water, trying to get her to drink the willow bark tea that Carmen had brewed. Sometimes Rose would swallow a little. Other times she would turn her head away, lost in fevered dreams. As night fell, Kieran sent Carmen home to her family and settled into the chair beside the bed, prepared for a long vigil. The hours stretched on. Rose tossed and turned, sometimes calling out words that made no sense, other times lying so still that Kieran would lean forward in panic, checking to make sure she was still breathing. He changed the cool cloths on her forehead regularly, and every hour he tried to get more water down her throat. Somewhere around midnight she opened her eyes. For a moment they were clear, focusing on his face with confusion. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice raw and rough. "You are at my ranch," Kieran said, leaning forward. "I am Kieran Garrett. You came on the stage today, but you were very sick." She stared at him, processing this information slowly. "The stage," she repeated, then her eyes widened slightly. We were supposed to meet." "We did meet," he said with a small smile, "just not quite how I imagined." She tried to smile back but winced instead. "I feel terrible. Everything hurts. You have a fever, a bad one, but you are going to be fine. You just need to rest and drink water." "I am sorry," she whispered. "This was not what I planned. Do not apologize. You cannot help being sick. Now drink this." He held the cup of willow bark tea to her lips, and this time she managed several sips before falling back against the pillows. "It tastes awful," she said, but her eyes were already closing again. "The best medicines usually do," Kieran replied, but she was already asleep again, this time more peacefully than before. The fact that she had woken and spoken coherently gave Kieran hope. He settled back into his chair, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, and allowed himself to relax slightly. She was a fighter. He could see that already. The journey from Boston to San Elizario was brutal even in the best of conditions, and she had made it all the way here despite being ill. That took determination. Dawn broke hot and bright, as it always did in the Texas desert. Kieran woke from an uneasy doze in the chair to find Rose still sleeping, but when he touched her forehead, he thought perhaps the fever had broken slightly. Her skin was still too warm, but not the frightening, burning heat of the night before. Carmen arrived early, bringing breakfast that Kieran barely tasted. His attention was focused on Rose, who slept through most of the morning but woke again around noon. This time her eyes were clearer, and she looked around the room with more awareness. "Where are my clothes?" she asked, her voice still weak but steadier than before. "Being washed," Kieran said. "You were burning up with fever. We had to cool you down." A flush that had nothing to do with fever colored her cheeks. "You undressed me." "I did," he said matter-of-factly. "You were unconscious and dying of fever. Forgive me if I was more concerned with keeping you alive than preserving your modesty." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for taking care of me. I know this is not what you expected when you agreed to meet me." Kieran pulled his chair closer to the bed. "What I expected was to meet a woman named Rose Gardner who wrote me interesting letters about books and philosophy and her dreams of seeing the West. What I got was that same woman, who just happens to be sick. The rest is just circumstances." "You are kinder than I expected," Rose said softly. "Your letters were kind, but I thought perhaps you were just being polite." "I do not have time to be polite," Kieran said. "Life out here is too hard for false niceties. I meant everything I wrote to you." Rose looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes. "I meant everything I wrote too. I just hope you will not be disappointed when you actually get to know me." "The same could be said the other way," Kieran pointed out. "Right now, you have only seen me playing nursemaid. Wait until you see me covered in dust and horse manure after a long day working cattle. You might decide you made a mistake coming all this way." This time Rose did manage a small smile. "I doubt that very much." Over the next 3 days, Rose slowly improved. Her fever finally broke completely on the second night, leaving her weak and exhausted but clear-headed. Kieran or Carmen stayed with her constantly, bringing her broth and tea, helping her sit up, changing the sheets when they became soaked with sweat. It was intimate in a way that felt strange and right at the same time. They were essentially strangers, yet here Kieran was, caring for her in the most basic and vulnerable ways. As Rose grew stronger, they began to talk more. She told him about growing up in Boston, about her parents who had been teachers, about the fire that had taken them both and left her with nothing. She spoke of the loneliness of being a governess in other people's houses, always on the outside looking in at family life, never quite belonging anywhere. Kieran, in turn, told her about the ranch, about building it from nothing after he returned from fighting in the Indian Wars. He spoke carefully about those years, not wanting to burden her with the darkness he had seen. But she listened with understanding in her eyes that suggested she knew there was more to the story than he was telling. "Why did you decide to seek a bride through an agency?" Rose asked on the 4th day. She was sitting up in bed now, propped against pillows, her dark hair clean and braided over one shoulder. She looked much better, though still pale and thin. Kieran considered the question. He was sitting in his usual chair beside the bed, a position that had become almost comfortable over the past days. "Practical reasons, mostly. There are not many women out here, and the ones who are here are already married or not interested in a rancher who spends most of his days covered in dirt. I thought about going back east to find someone, but I cannot leave the ranch for that long. The agency seemed like a reasonable solution." "That is the practical reason," Rose said. "But what was the real reason?" He met her eyes, surprised by her perceptiveness. "I was lonely," he admitted. "This house is too big for one person. I built it hoping for more, for a family, but the years kept passing and nothing changed. I am 28 years old, and I was starting to think maybe that dream was not meant for me." Rose reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact, and the gesture touched him more than he expected. "I understand that feeling," she said quietly. "After my parents died, I felt so alone, like I was just going through the motions of living without any real purpose. When I saw your advertisement in the newspaper, something in it spoke to me. You wrote about wanting a partner, not just a housekeeper or someone to warm your bed. You wrote about building a life together. That was what I wanted too." "Is it still what you want?" Kieran asked. "Now that you are here and have seen what it is really like." "I have only seen the inside of this room," Rose pointed out with a small smile. "But yes, I think it is still what I want, if you still want it too." "I do," Kieran said simply. He squeezed her hand gently, "but I want you to be sure. You need time to recover fully, time to see the ranch and understand what life here really means. There is no rush. You can stay here as long as you need, and if you decide this is not the life for you, I will pay for your passage back to Boston." Rose shook her head firmly. "I am not going back to Boston, I am sure of that much. Whether I stay here or go somewhere else, I cannot go back." "Then stay," Kieran said. "Stay and get well. Stay and learn about the ranch. Stay and see if this life suits you. We can take our time deciding about the rest." "That sounds fair," Rose agreed. She yawned suddenly, still easily tired. "I am sorry I keep falling asleep on you." "Sleep is how you heal," Kieran said, standing and tucking the blankets around her. "Rest now. I will be here when you wake." As Rose's eyes closed, Kieran settled back into his chair, watching her peaceful face. Something was growing between them, something that felt deeper than the polite interest of two strangers who had agreed to consider marriage. The intimacy forced upon them by her illness had created a bond that might have taken months to develop under normal circumstances. He was beginning to care for her, genuinely care, in a way that both excited and frightened him. By the end of the week, Rose was well enough to leave the bed for short periods. Carmen helped her bathe and found her some clothes that had been Kieran's mother's, stored away in a trunk. They fit reasonably well with a few quick adjustments. Rose insisted on coming downstairs for dinner, despite Kieran's protests that she should rest more. "I am going mad staring at those four walls," she said firmly. "I need to see something else, even if it is just your dining room." Kieran helped her down the stairs, keeping a careful arm around her waist in case she grew dizzy. She was still weak but determined, and he found he admired that quality in her. At the bottom of the stairs, Rose stopped and looked around with interest. The house was simply but solidly furnished. Kieran had built most of the furniture himself, working in the evenings after long days on the range. The pieces were sturdy and practical, but there were small touches that suggested a man who cared about his home. Bookcases lined one wall of the main room, filled with volumes that looked well-read. A colorful woven rug covered part of the wooden floor, and curtains in a deep blue hung at the windows. "You have books," Rose said with delight, moving toward the shelves. "I told you in my letters that I liked to read," Kieran reminded her. "I know, but somehow I did not picture it." She ran her fingers along the spines. "Shakespeare, Dickens, Twain, Whitman, you have excellent taste." "My mother was a teacher back in Missouri," Kieran explained. "She made sure I was educated before we moved out here. Most of those books were hers." Rose turned to look at him. "She passed away 5 years ago, pneumonia. My father died even earlier when I was fighting in the war. He was thrown from a horse and broke his neck." "I am sorry," Rose said softly. "So you are alone out here." "I have Miguel and Carmen and the other ranch hands," Kieran said. "But yes, in the ways that matter most, I have been alone." They ate dinner at the long wooden table in the dining room. Carmen had outdone herself, making chicken with rice and beans, fresh tortillas, and a fruit compote for dessert. Rose ate more than she had in days, and color began to return to her cheeks. After dinner, Kieran helped her to the porch, where they sat in rocking chairs and watched the sun set over the desert. "It is beautiful here," Rose said, watching the sky turn from blue to pink to deep orange. "So different from Boston. Do you miss it?" Kieran asked. "Not as much as I thought I would," Rose admitted. "Boston felt like a cage after my parents died. Everything there reminded me of what I had lost. This feels like a place where I could build something new." "It will not be easy," Kieran warned. "Life out here is hard. The heat in summer is brutal. Water is scarce sometimes. There are dangers you would never encounter in the city." "I did not come here because I wanted easy," Rose said, turning to look at him. "I came here because I wanted real. I wanted a life that meant something, with someone who saw me as a partner. That is what you offered in your letters. That is what I am hoping to find." Kieran reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then that is what we will build together," he said. "If you are willing to give this a real chance." "I am," Rose said. "Are you?" "More than I have ever been willing to give anything," Kieran admitted. They sat together as darkness fell, holding hands and watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. It was not the courtship either of them had imagined, but somehow it felt right. They had already seen each other in vulnerable moments, had already built a foundation of trust and care. Everything else would follow in time. Over the next weeks, Rose grew stronger day by day. She began taking walks around the ranch, first just to the barn and back, then gradually farther. Kieran showed her everything, introducing her to the horses and cattle, explaining how the ranch operated, teaching her about the land and its rhythms. Rose absorbed it all eagerly, asking questions and genuinely trying to understand this new world she had entered. She also began taking over some of the household duties, much to Carmen's relief. Rose proved to be a capable cook once she learned to work with the ingredients available in Texas, which were quite different from what she had known in Boston. She turned out to be skilled with a needle, mending clothes and making curtains for the windows. She organized Kieran's books and papers, bringing order to corners of the house he had long neglected. But more than the practical help, Rose brought life to the house. She sang while she worked, filling the rooms with music. She read aloud in the evenings, her expressive voice bringing stories to life. She asked Kieran about his day and genuinely listened to his answers. She made him laugh with her wry observations about ranch life. The house that had felt empty for so long suddenly felt like a home. As August turned to September, Kieran found himself falling in love with Rose in earnest. It was not the sudden, overwhelming passion of novels, but something deeper and steadier. He loved the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. He loved how she was never afraid to get her hands dirty when there was work to be done. He loved her kindness to Carmen and Miguel, and the way she had learned to speak to them in their own language. He loved her strength, the way she had survived illness and loss and still faced each new day with optimism. One evening in mid-September, they were sitting on the porch after dinner when Rose turned to him with a serious expression. "Kieran, we need to talk about our arrangement." His stomach dropped. "All right." "We have been living in this uncertain state for over a month now," Rose said. "You have been incredibly kind and patient, letting me recover and learn about this life. But we cannot continue like this indefinitely. People in town are starting to talk." "Let them talk," Kieran said. "I do not care what they think." "But I do," Rose said. "Not for my sake, but for yours. You have a reputation to maintain, and I do not want to damage it. We need to make a decision. Either I am your wife or I am not. Either we move forward with this, or I need to find another arrangement." Kieran stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the darkening land. When he turned back, Rose was watching him with her heart in her eyes. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to marry you," Rose said simply. "I have wanted it for weeks now, but I was not sure if you still felt the same way. In your letters, you were interested in a bride. But then I arrived sick, and everything changed. I would understand if you have had second thoughts." Kieran crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her to her feet, taking both her hands in his. "I have not had second thoughts. If anything, the last month has shown me exactly why I wanted to find someone like you. You are strong and brave and kind. You do not complain about the hardships. You work hard and you care about this place and the people here. You make me laugh, and you make this house feel like a home. I love you, Rose. I think I started falling in love with you through your letters, but now that I know you in person, I am certain." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I was so afraid you would not feel the same way, that you were just being kind out of obligation." "Never obligation," Kieran said. He cupped her face in his hands, wiping away a tear with his thumb. "You have become everything to me. Will you marry me? Not because of some arrangement through an agency, but because we choose each other." "Yes," Rose said. "Yes, I will marry you." Kieran kissed her then, finally, their first real kiss. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both were smiling, and the uncertainty that had hung over them for weeks had finally lifted. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in San Elizario. The ceremony was simple, attended by Miguel and Carmen, a few neighboring ranchers, and some townspeople who had become friendly with Kieran over the years. Rose wore a dress that Carmen had helped her make, pale blue with white lace trim. Kieran wore his best suit, the one he had bought years ago in El Paso and rarely had occasion to wear. The priest, Father Domingo, performed the ceremony in both English and Spanish, blessing their union and speaking about the importance of partnership in marriage. When Kieran placed the ring on Rose's finger, a simple gold band he had ordered from the jeweler in town, his hand was shaking slightly. But Rose's hand was steady as she placed a ring on his finger in return, and when they sealed their vows with a kiss, Kieran felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, with Carmen and several other women from nearby farms preparing a feast. There was music and dancing, and even though Rose did not know all the steps to the Mexican dances, she laughed and tried her best. Kieran, who usually avoided dancing, found himself enjoying it with Rose in his arms. As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Kieran and Rose found themselves alone in their house for the first time as husband and wife. There was a moment of awkwardness, both aware that the relationship was about to shift again into new territory. "Are you nervous?" Kieran asked, taking Rose's hand. "A little," she admitted. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said with a rueful smile, "but in a good way." Rose laughed and squeezed his hand. "We will figure it out together. We have figured out everything else." And they did figure it out, finding in each other a passion and tenderness that deepened their already strong connection. That night marked the true beginning of their marriage, and in the morning, they woke wrapped in each other's arms, both feeling that they had finally found where they belonged. The autumn months passed in a blur of work and happiness. Rose threw herself into ranch life completely, learning everything she could about running the household and even helping with some of the lighter ranch work. She had a way with the horses that surprised everyone, and Kieran often found her in the barn, brushing down the animals and talking to them in her gentle voice. The first challenge to their happiness came in November, when a series of storms brought heavy rains that flooded part of the grazing land and washed out fences. Kieran and the ranch hands worked long, exhausting days repairing the damage and moving cattle to higher ground. Rose worked just as hard, cooking hot meals for the men and riding out with supplies when they were needed. One evening, Kieran came home to find Rose in the kitchen, covered in flour and looking exhausted. "What are you doing?" he asked, concerned. "You should be resting." "I am making bread for tomorrow," Rose said. "The men need to eat and Carmen has been working herself to the bone. I sent her home to rest." Kieran crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You are exhausted too. Let me help." "You have been working in the rain all day," Rose protested. "You should rest." "We will rest when the bread is done," Kieran said. "Show me what to do." Working together, they finished the bread and then tackled the mountain of dishes that had accumulated. As they worked side by side, wet and tired and covered in flour, Kieran found himself thinking about how right this felt. This was partnership, true partnership, both of them shouldering the burdens together. "Thank you," he said as they finally headed upstairs. "For what?" Rose asked. "For being here. For not just being my wife but being my partner. For working as hard as any ranch hand and never complaining." Rose smiled and took his hand. "This is what I signed up for. This is what I wanted. A real life with a real partner. You have given me that." In December, Rose began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be certain before telling Kieran, wanting to be sure. When she finally shared the news with him one evening after dinner, he was overcome with emotion. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and she felt dampness on her cheek that she realized were his tears. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice thick with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Rose asked, though she could tell from his reaction that he was. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Kieran said. He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you happy? Are you scared?" "Both," Rose admitted. "I never thought I would have children. I thought that dream died with my parents. But now it is happening and I am thrilled and terrified in equal measure." "We will figure it out together," Kieran promised, echoing her words from their wedding night. "Just like we figure out everything else." The winter months passed peacefully. Rose's pregnancy progressed normally, though she suffered from morning sickness that actually lasted most of the day. Kieran was attentive and worried, bringing her tea and crackers, rubbing her back when she was ill, and insisting she rest more than she wanted to. As Rose's belly began to grow, Kieran found himself marveling at the miracle of it. He would place his hand on her stomach in the evenings, feeling the baby move, and feel overwhelmed by love for both Rose and this child they had created together. He built a cradle in his workshop, carving intricate designs into the wood. Carmen helped Rose sew baby clothes, and the women would sit together on the porch, their needles flashing in the sunlight as they prepared for the new arrival. Spring came with wildflowers blooming across the desert, and Rose grew large and uncomfortable. She could no longer ride or do much of the physical work she had taken on, which frustrated her immensely. Kieran tried to get her to rest more, but Rose was stubborn. She continued to cook and clean and organize, determined to be useful. "You are growing our child," Kieran reminded her one day when she was particularly frustrated. "That is the most important job there is." "I know," Rose sighed, "but I feel so useless just sitting around." "Then read to me," Kieran suggested. "In the evenings after dinner, read to me like you used to. I have missed that." So Rose returned to reading aloud in the evenings, and Kieran would sit and listen to her voice while doing small tasks like mending tack or sharpening tools. It became their favorite part of the day, a peaceful interlude in the busy life of the ranch. In May, as the weather grew hot again, Rose went into labor. It was early morning, and Kieran woke to find her gripping his arm, her face tight with pain. "The baby is coming," she said through gritted teeth. Kieran's mind went blank with panic for a moment before training took over. He sent Miguel racing to town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered most of the babies in the area. Carmen came to help, and together they got Rose comfortable and began timing the contractions. The labor was long and difficult. Rose was small and the baby large, and as the hours stretched on with no progress, Kieran began to fear the worst. He held Rose's hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, and felt utterly helpless as she suffered. "I cannot do this," Rose gasped at one point, her face pale and sweating. "It hurts too much." "You can," Kieran said firmly, gripping her hand. "You are the strongest person I know. You survived fever, you survived leaving everything you knew, you survived learning to live in this harsh place. You can survive this too." Rose looked at him with exhausted eyes, but she nodded. "Stay with me, do not leave." "Never," Kieran promised. "I am right here, Mrs. Patterson finally arrived in the afternoon, and with her help and encouragement, Rose pushed through the final, agonizing stage of labor. As the sun began to set, painting the room in golden light, a baby's cry finally filled the air. Kieran felt tears streaming down his face as Mrs. Patterson placed the squalling infant in Rose's arms. "You have a son," the midwife announced with a tired smile. Rose cradled the baby close, examining every tiny feature with wonder. The baby had stopped crying and was looking up at her with dark, unfocused eyes. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Kieran leaned over them both, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "He is perfect," he said in awe. "You did so well, Rose. I am so proud of you. We should name him," Rose said, looking up at Kieran. "What do you think of Kenneth? After your father," Kieran swallowed hard. "Are you sure? That would mean a lot." "I am sure," Rose said. "Kenneth Garrett, it is a strong name for a strong boy." Little Kenneth was indeed strong, crying lustily when he wanted to eat and keeping them up many nights with his demands. Kieran found himself stumbling through his days half asleep, but he did not mind. Every smile from Rose, every tiny sound from Kenneth, made the exhaustion worthwhile. Rose recovered well from the birth, regaining her strength over the following weeks. They fell into a new rhythm, learning to balance the demands of the baby with the work of the ranch. Kieran found himself enchanted by his son, spending long periods just watching him sleep or holding him while Rose rested. Summer blazed hot again, but the ranch prospered. The cattle were healthy, the water held, and there were no major disasters. Kieran hired another ranch hand to help with the work, which gave him more time to spend with Rose and Kenneth. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch with Kenneth between them, watching the sunset and talking about their plans for the future. "I want more children," Rose said one evening when Kenneth was about 3 months old. "Not right away, but someday. I want him to have brothers and sisters." "I want that too," Kieran agreed. "This house needs to be filled with life and laughter." "We could add on," Rose suggested. "Build more rooms as the family grows." "I was thinking the same thing," Kieran said. "Maybe start planning this winter when work slows down." They smiled at each other, both thinking about the future they were building together. It was not the life either of them had imagined a year ago, but it was better than anything they could have dreamed. The first anniversary of Rose's arrival in San Elizario came in August, hot and bright like the day she had come on the stagecoach. Kieran woke early that morning and lay in bed watching Rose sleep, Kenneth in his cradle nearby. It was hard to believe it had only been a year. It felt like Rose had always been here, like his life before her had been just waiting for her to arrive. When Rose woke, Kieran was still watching her. "Good morning," she murmured, smiling. "Why are you staring at me?" "Just thinking," Kieran said. Do you know what day it is? Rose thought for a moment, then her eyes widened. A year ago today, I arrived here half dead with fever. Best day of my life, Kieran said. Even though I thought you might die before I even got to know you. Rose laughed and snuggled closer to him. Not the most romantic first meeting. No, but it was ours, Kieran said, and I would not change a single thing. Not even the fever, Rose teased. Not even the fever, Kieran confirmed. Because it meant I got to take care of you, to see your strength and courage right from the start. We built something real right from the beginning without any pretense. That was worth the fear. Kenneth chose that moment to wake up, demanding breakfast with his usual insistence. Rose sighed and started to get up, but Kieran stopped her. "Let me," he said. "You stay in bed a little longer. I will bring him to you when he is changed." Rose settled back against the pillows, watching with love in her eyes as Kieran picked up their son and carried him to the changing table. These quiet domestic moments were just as precious to her as the grand romantic gestures might have been. This was real life, real love, built on partnership and trust and daily choices to put each other first. As autumn came again, bringing cooler temperatures and the busy season of preparing for winter, Kieran and Rose worked together seamlessly. Kenneth was crawling now, getting into everything and keeping both of them busy. But they were happy, deeply and genuinely happy, in a way that felt solid and lasting. One evening in October, after Kenneth was asleep and they were sitting on the porch in the cool air, Rose turned to Kieran with a familiar expression on her face. "I have something to tell you," she said. Kieran grinned. "You are pregnant again, are not you?" Rose laughed. "Am I that obvious?" "Your face gets this particular glow," Kieran said, pulling her close. "How long have you known?" "A few weeks," Rose admitted. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." "How do you feel?" Kieran asked, concerned. "Are you sick like last time?" "Not as bad," Rose said. "A little queasy in the mornings, but nothing terrible." Kieran placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Another baby. Kenneth will be a big brother. Are you happy?" Rose asked, echoing the question from the first pregnancy. "Always happy with you," Kieran said, kissing her softly. "We are building the family we dreamed about. How could I be anything but happy?" The second pregnancy was easier than the first. Rose felt better throughout, and labor, when it came in June, was shorter and less difficult. This time they had a daughter, with Rose's dark hair and Kieran's eyes. They named her Rebecca, after Rose's mother, and she was a calmer baby than Kenneth had been, content to sleep and eat and watch the world with peaceful interest. With 2 children now, life became busier but also richer. Kenneth adored his baby sister, always wanting to help with her care. Kieran found himself working harder than ever, trying to keep the ranch prosperous enough to support his growing family. But he never resented it, because everything he did was for Rose and the children, and that gave his work meaning beyond just survival. Rose amazed him with her ability to manage everything. She cared for 2 small children, kept the house running smoothly, helped with ranch accounts, and still found time to read in the evenings and talk with Kieran about books and ideas and dreams for the future. She had grown from the refined Eastern governess into a true frontier woman, strong and capable and utterly at home in the harsh Texas landscape. The years passed in a blur of small moments and steady growth. Kenneth grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the horses and followed Kieran everywhere. Rebecca was quieter but clever, always watching and learning. In time, there was a third child, another son they named Robert, who was a perfect mix of his siblings, energetic but thoughtful. As the children grew, Kieran and Rose grew deeper in love. They had their arguments, of course, as any couple does. They fought about money, about how to discipline the children, about whether to expand the ranch or keep it the size it was. But they always worked through it, always came back to the fundamental truth that they were partners and that they loved each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kieran surprised Rose with a trip to El Paso. It was the first time they had left the ranch overnight since Rebecca was born, and Carmen and Miguel agreed to watch the children for 3 days. Kieran had saved for months to afford the trip and to buy Rose a proper anniversary present. They stayed in a real hotel with hot baths and soft beds. They ate in restaurants and attended the theater. Kieran bought Rose a necklace with a small ruby pendant, and she cried when he fastened it around her neck. But the best part of the trip was simply having uninterrupted time together, talking and laughing and remembering who they were before they became parents. "You ever regret it?" Kieran asked one evening as they sat in the hotel restaurant. "Giving up your life in Boston to come out here?" Rose looked at him with surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" "Because life here is so hard," Kieran said. "Harder than I ever explained in my letters. You work constantly, you rarely have nice things, you live miles from any real town. I just wonder sometimes if you wish you had made a different choice." Rose reached across the table and took his hand. "Kieran, you have given me everything I ever wanted. A home, a family, a purpose. Yes, the work is hard, but it is work that matters. I am not raising other people's children and living in their houses. I am raising our children in our home. Every day I wake up next to the man I love, and we build something together. That is worth more than all the fancy dresses and theater tickets in Boston." "I love you," Kieran said simply. "More than I did the day we married, which I did not think was possible." "I love you too," Rose said. "Thank you for this trip. It has been wonderful, but I will be just as happy to get home to our children and our ranch." They returned home to find all 3 children healthy and happy, though clearly glad to have their parents back. Kenneth, now 9, had helped Miguel with some of the ranch work and was bursting with pride to tell his father about it. Rebecca, at 7, had read 3 books while they were gone and wanted to tell her mother about each one in detail. Little Robert, only 4, just wanted to be held and cuddled, and both Kieran and Rose were happy to oblige. That night, after the children were asleep, Kieran and Rose stood on the porch looking out at their land. The house had been expanded twice now, with additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The barn was bigger, the corrals improved, the grazing land extended. But more than the physical changes, the ranch felt alive in a way it never had when Kieran lived here alone. Children's laughter filled the air during the day. Rose's singing drifted from the kitchen windows. The house was truly a home now, filled with love and life. "Do you remember the first night I was here?" Rose asked, leaning against Kieran's shoulder. "When I was so sick I barely knew where I was." "I remember," Kieran said. "I was terrified you would die before I got to know you." "I remember waking up and seeing you sitting beside the bed," Rose said. "You looked so worried and so kind. I think I started falling in love with you right then, even though I was too sick to realize it." "I was already falling for you from your letters," Kieran admitted. "But seeing you fight through that fever, seeing your strength even when you were at your weakest, that is when I knew you were the one I wanted beside me for the rest of my life." "And here we are," Rose said, 10 years and 3 children later. "Best 10 years of my life," Kieran said, pulling her close. "Here is to 50 more." They stood together in the darkness, 2 people who had taken a chance on a future neither could have predicted. They had built something real and lasting, a love that grew stronger with each passing year, a family that filled their home with joy, a life that had meaning and purpose. Rose had arrived with a fever, half dead and uncertain. Kieran had nursed her back to health, giving her not just medicine and care but hope and love. In return, she had brought his empty house to life, had given him the family he longed for, had made his dreams reality. They were partners in every sense of the word, facing the hardships of frontier life together and celebrating the joys together. They worked side by side, raised their children together, and built a legacy that would outlast them both. As the years continued to pass, Kieran and Rose grew older but not apart. When Kenneth was 15, he began taking on more responsibility on the ranch, working alongside his father and learning the business. Rebecca showed an unexpected talent for numbers and began helping her mother with the ranch accounts, catching errors and suggesting improvements. Robert loved the horses most of all and spent hours training the young ones, showing a patience and skill that amazed everyone. More children were born, though Rose and Kieran agreed after the sixth that their family was complete. The house rang with noise and chaos and love, exactly as Kieran had dreamed when he first built it. There were illnesses and accidents, triumphs and disappointments, but through it all, Rose and Kieran remained each other's anchor and support. On their 20th anniversary, their children planned a celebration that brought together everyone from miles around. Neighbors and friends filled the ranch, sharing food and music and stories. Kenneth, now 19 and courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, gave a toast thanking his parents for showing him what a real marriage looked like. Rebecca, 17 and already accepted to a teaching college in El Paso, spoke about her mother's strength and her father's kindness. The younger children added their own tributes, some funny and some touching. When it was finally just the two of them again, alone in their bedroom as the last guests departed, Rose and Kieran looked at each other and laughed. "We did all right, did we not?" Rose said. "More than all right," Kieran agreed. "We built something beautiful." "I still remember being on that stagecoach, burning with fever and wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life," Rose said. "I was so scared, but I was more scared of staying in Boston and living a half-life forever." "I was scared too," Kieran admitted. Standing in town waiting for that stage, not knowing if the woman who got off would be anything like the person I had imagined from her letters. And then you did not get off. You had to be carried off, and I thought maybe this was a sign that I was not meant to have this. "But you did not give up," Rose said. "You took care of me. You gave me time to heal and time to decide if this was really what I wanted. You never pressured me or made me feel obligated." "Because I wanted you to choose this," Kieran said. "I wanted you to choose me." "And you did, and it has made all the difference." They kissed, a kiss that still held passion after 20 years but also held something deeper. Comfort, trust, partnership, friendship, love in all its forms combined into something that would last until their final days. The ranch continued to prosper. Kenneth eventually married his sweetheart and built a house on the far side of the property, running his own herd while still helping with the main ranch. Rebecca finished her teaching degree and returned to San Elizario, starting a school that educated children from all the surrounding ranches. The younger children each found their own paths, some staying on the ranch and some venturing out to make their own way in the world. Through it all, Kieran and Rose remained the heart of the family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They grew old together, their faces gaining lines and their hair turning gray, but their love never dimming. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, still held hands, still talked about everything and nothing. When they celebrated their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Kieran pulled Rose aside for a private moment. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Rose asked, though she was smiling. "For getting on that stagecoach 30 years ago, for making the journey out here even though you were sick, for choosing me and choosing this life, for giving me everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I needed. Thank you for being the kind of man I could choose, Rose replied. For being patient and kind and strong, for building this life with me, for loving me through all the hard times and celebrating with me through all the good times. They kissed, surrounded by the noise of their family, and both felt profound gratitude for the chances they had taken and the love they had found. Years later, when Kieran was 58 and Rose was 53, they sat on that same porch on a cool autumn evening. Their children were grown, many with families of their own. The ranch was thriving under Kenneth's capable management, though Kieran still helped when he could. Rose's school had expanded, with Rebecca now training other teachers to work throughout the territory. We did well, Kieran said, taking Rose's hand as they watched the sunset. We did, Rose agreed. Better than I ever imagined possible. That day I arrived here burning with fever. That fever brought you to me, Kieran said. If you had arrived healthy, we might have had a polite courtship, might have taken months to really know each other. Instead, we were thrown into intimacy right from the start. I got to see your strength and your vulnerability all at once. It made me fall in love with you faster than I would have thought possible. I fell in love with you taking care of me, Rose said. You were so gentle and so worried. You sat by my bed night after night, making sure I did not slip away. How could I not love you after that? We got lucky, Kieran said. Two strangers taking a chance, and it turned out to be the best decision either of us ever made. Not luck, Rose corrected. Choice. We chose each other, and then we chose each other again every day after that. That is what made this work. Kieran squeezed her hand. I would choose you every time. In every life, in every circumstance, I would choose you. And I would choose you, Rose said. Always. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, two people who had built a life together out of hope and hard work and love. They had faced challenges that might have broken a weaker couple. They had celebrated joys that were all the sweeter for being shared. They had raised 6 children who were all strong, capable, good people. They had built a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. But more than any of that, they had loved each other deeply and truly for 3 decades, and that love showed no signs of fading. They still made each other laugh. They still supported each other through hard times. They still looked at each other and felt grateful to have found someone who understood them so completely. As they finally rose to go inside, Kieran paused and looked back at the land stretching out before them, barely visible now in the darkness. This ranch, this life, none of it meant anything until you came, he said. You made it all real. We made it real together, Rose said, taking his arm. That has always been our strength. We are partners in everything. In everything, Kieran agreed, and they walked inside together, ready for whatever years remained to them, knowing that as long as they had each other, they had everything they needed. The seasons continued to turn, bringing their expected changes. They celebrated holidays and birthdays surrounded by family. They weathered droughts and storms and all the challenges that came with ranch life. They mourned when old friends passed and celebrated when grandchildren were born. They grew older, slower, but never lost the essential connection that had been forged in those first days when Rose arrived sick and Kieran nursed her back to health. When Kieran was 65 and Rose was 60, they decided it was time to fully turn the ranch over to Kenneth. They would stay in the main house, but the daily operations and decisions would be his. It was a bittersweet transition for Kieran, who had poured his life into the ranch, but he knew it was time. He wanted to spend his remaining years focusing on Rose and their family, not worrying about cattle prices and water rights. With more free time, they rediscovered the quiet pleasures they had enjoyed when they first married. They read together in the evenings, sometimes aloud like in the old days. They took walks around the property, moving slower than they once had but enjoying the journey more. They visited their children and grandchildren, delighting in watching the younger generations grow. On quiet evenings, they would sometimes talk about those early days, remembering the fear and excitement and hope that had characterized the beginning of their relationship. "I nearly died before we even met properly," Rose would say, shaking her head. "What are the chances I would survive the journey from Boston only to almost die in your arms before we could say a proper hello?" "You survived because you are a fighter," Kieran would always reply. "You were determined to make it to me, and nothing was going to stop you, not even a fever that should have killed you." "I survived because you took care of me," Rose would correct. "You saved my life before you even knew me. That says everything about who you are." They would go back and forth like this, each insisting the other deserved more credit, and it would always end with them laughing at themselves and kissing like young lovers, even with their gray hair and lined faces. Their love story became legendary in the area. Young couples would ask them for advice, wondering how they had managed to stay so in love for so many years. The answer was always simple but not easy. "We chose each other every day," Rose would say. "Even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, we chose to love each other." "And we were partners," Kieran would add. "Neither one of us was more important than the other. We made decisions together, we worked together, we faced everything together." As they moved into their 70s, their health began to decline as it does for everyone. Kieran's joints ached on cold mornings, legacy of decades of hard ranch work. Rose's eyesight began to fail, making reading more difficult. But they adapted, helping each other with tasks that grew harder, never complaining about the passage of time because they were grateful for every year they had together. One spring morning when Kieran was 73 and Rose was 68, they sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching the sun rise. It was a ritual they had maintained for decades, this quiet time together before the day truly began. Rose leaned her head on Kieran's shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat in perfect contentment. "I am so grateful," Rose said softly, "for all of this. For you, for our children, for this life we built. I could not have asked for anything better." "Neither could I," Kieran agreed. "When I sent that advertisement to the matrimonial agency, I was hoping for a companion, someone to share the work and maybe provide some company. I never dreamed I would find a love like this." "I was hoping for safety and security," Rose admitted. "A place to belong after losing my parents. I never imagined I would find passion and partnership and a love that would sustain me for an entire lifetime." "We both got more than we bargained for," Kieran said with a smile. "The best kind of surprise," Rose said. They continued to sit there as the sun climbed higher, warming their old bones and illuminating the land that had been their home for so many years. This ranch, which had once been just dirt and dreams, was now a thriving operation supporting multiple families. The house, which had once been empty and silent, now rang with the voices of children and grandchildren who visited often. The life, which had once felt incomplete, was now full to overflowing with love and meaning. Kieran thought back to that August day 45 years ago when he had stood in town waiting for the stagecoach, nervous and hopeful, and not knowing that his entire life was about to change. He thought about carrying Rose's fever-racked body into this house, terrified he would lose her before he even got to know her. He thought about nursing her through those long nights, watching her fight for every breath, and falling in love with her strength and courage. He had saved her life in those first days, it was true. But she had saved him too, in ways that mattered just as much. She had saved him from loneliness, from a life of empty routine, from giving up on the dream of having a family. She had brought light and life and love into his world, and everything good that had followed could be traced back to that moment when he first saw her in the stagecoach, sick and vulnerable and brave. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked, noticing his faraway expression. "The day you arrived," Kieran said. "How scared I was that I would lose you. How grateful I am that you survived." "I think about that day too," Rose said. "I was so sick, but I remember moments of it. I remember opening my eyes and seeing you there, this stranger who was taking care of me with such tenderness. I remember thinking, even in my fever, that maybe I had made the right choice coming here." "You did make the right choice," Kieran said firmly. "The best choice." "So did you," Rose replied, "choosing me out of all the women who probably responded to your advertisement." "There was something about your letters," Kieran said. "They were honest and thoughtful. You did not try to pretend to be something you were not. You wrote about real things, about loss and hope and wanting to build something meaningful. I felt like I knew you before we ever met." "I felt the same way," Rose said. "Your letters made me feel like I had found someone who would truly be a partner, and you have been, every single day since." As the morning stretched on, their children and grandchildren began to arrive. It was Sunday, and the whole family gathered for dinner after church every week. The house filled with noise and activity, children running through the rooms, adults catching up on the week's events, food being prepared in the kitchen. Rose and Kieran sat in the middle of it all, the center around which everything else revolved, and felt deeply satisfied with what they had created together. After dinner, when everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Rose and Kieran returned to the porch. It was their favorite place, this spot where they could look out over the land and remember all the years they had spent together. "I hope I go first," Rose said suddenly. Kieran looked at her in surprise. "Why would you say that?" "Because I cannot imagine this life without you," Rose said simply. "I do not want to learn how to live without you beside me." "I feel the same way," Kieran admitted, "but one of us will have to learn. That is just how it goes." "I know," Rose said, "but I still hope it is you who stays. You are stronger than me. You would manage better." "You are the strongest person I know," Kieran disagreed. "If anyone could go on, it would be you." "Then let us hope we go together," Rose said. "At the same time in our sleep, old and happy and content." "That is a nice dream," Kieran agreed, though they both knew life rarely worked out so neatly. But as it turned out, life was kind to them in the end. They had several more good years together, growing older but never growing apart. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a joyous occasion, with music and dancing and speeches honoring the couple who had built such a strong foundation for their family. 2 years later, in the spring when the wildflowers bloomed and the desert came alive with color, Rose caught a cold that turned into pneumonia. Despite the doctor's best efforts and Kieran's devoted care, echoing those first days when he had nursed her through fever, she did not recover. She died peacefully one morning with Kieran holding her hand, her children surrounding the bed, and her last words were, "I love you. Thank you for everything." Kieran was devastated. For the first time in 52 years, he was truly alone. The house felt empty despite being full of family who came to comfort him. The bed was cold despite the warm spring weather. The mornings were unbearable without Rose beside him on the porch, but he carried on, as Rose would have wanted him to. He spent time with his children and grandchildren, sharing stories about Rose and keeping her memory alive. He continued his routines, still sitting on the porch each morning with 2 cups of coffee, one for him and one in memory of Rose. He found comfort in the life they had built together, in the legacy they had created, in the love that had sustained them for over half a century. He lasted 6 months without her. His children worried about him, seeing how he faded without his partner by his side. But Kieran was at peace. He had lived a full life, a good life, a life filled with love and meaning. He had found in Rose everything he had hoped for and so much more. They had built something beautiful together, and that beauty would continue in their children and grandchildren and the generations to come. One autumn morning, Kieran sat on the porch with his coffee, watching the sun rise as he had done for so many years. He felt Rose's presence beside him, as he often did these days, and he smiled. "I am ready," he said aloud as if she could hear him. "I am ready to come join you now." That evening, surrounded by his children, Kieran closed his eyes and did not open them again. He went peacefully, with a smile on his face, and his children took comfort in knowing he was reunited with the love of his life. They buried him beside Rose in the small cemetery outside San Elizario, under a large oak tree that provided shade in the harsh Texas sun. The headstones were simple, listing their names and dates, but they also bore an inscription that Kieran had requested before he died. "Partners in life, partners in eternity." The ranch continued under Kenneth's management, then passed to his children and then to theirs. The house stood strong, still filled with family, still echoing with the love that Kieran and Rose had poured into it. Their story became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, an example of what real love looked like, what partnership meant, what commitment required. Young couples starting their own journeys would visit the graves and leave flowers, asking for Kieran and Rose's blessing on their own unions. The porch where they had spent so many mornings and evenings together became a sacred space in family tradition, a place for important conversations and quiet reflection. And on spring mornings when the wildflowers bloomed, or on autumn evenings when the air turned cool, family members who sat on that porch sometimes felt a presence, a sense of peace and enduring love that seemed to emanate from the very boards beneath their feet. They would smile and think of Kieran and Rose, the mail-order bride who arrived with a fever and the rancher who nursed her back to health. And they would remember that the greatest adventures often begin with the simplest act of caring for another person, and that the deepest love grows from choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through sickness and health, through hardship and joy, until death and beyond. Their love story, which began with fear and fever in August of 1878, had grown into something that transcended time, a testament to the power of partnership and the endurance of true love. They had taken a chance on each other when they were strangers, had built a life together when they were young, had grown old together with grace and gratitude, and had left behind a legacy that would continue for generations to come. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of love story both of them had dreamed of when they first wrote their tentative letters to a matrimonial agency, hoping against hope that somewhere out there was someone who would understand them, choose them, and love them for exactly who they were.